They laughed the moment the old pickup truck rolled onto their quiet street, never imagining that the young woman behind the wheel would one day become the reason they still called that neighborhood home. Claire Bennett eased her faded blue pickup into the narrow driveway of the smallest house on Maple Ridge Lane, a peaceful suburban neighborhood just outside Portland, Oregon, where perfectly trimmed lawns, fresh flower beds, and polished SUVs quietly reflected years of comfort and quiet prosperity. The little white cottage she had purchased had been vacant for months, its front porch worn by rain and its garden overtaken by weeds. Yet Claire smiled as she stepped out wearing a simple light blue dress and carrying nothing more than a cardboard box filled with books and family photographs. To her, it was not an old house. It was a chance to begin again. Across the street, curtains shifted almost immediately. Front doors opened. Neighbors drifted onto their porches with coffee mugs in hand, pretending to enjoy the pleasant spring weather while their attention remained fixed on the unfamiliar newcomer. Evelyn Parker folded her arms with quiet confidence as she stood beside her husband, Thomas, studying Claire from head to toe. The modest dress, the worn truck, the second-hand lawnmower strapped into the truck bed. Every detail seemed to confirm the story Evelyn had already written in her mind. "Looks like the property values are about to get tested," she murmured with a faint smile. A few nearby neighbors chuckled softly, careful not to be heard. Thomas glanced toward Claire for another moment before shrugging. Maybe she just likes simple living. Evelyn shook her head. People who can afford this neighborhood do not move in with furniture tied down by rope. Claire heard none of it. She carefully carried another box toward the porch, pausing only to wave warmly when she noticed several people watching her. A few returned the gesture with polite smiles. Most simply looked away. By late afternoon, the neighborhood had already begun talking. Some wondered where she came from. Others guessed she had inherited the house. A few quietly questioned whether she could afford to stay. None of them walked across the street to introduce themselves. The only person who did was an elderly man named Harold Green, who slowly crossed the sidewalk carrying a small basket of freshly baked muffins. "Welcome to Maple Ridge," he said kindly. Claire accepted the gift with genuine gratitude. "Thank you. That is incredibly thoughtful." Harold smiled after noticing the carefully labeled boxes stacked neatly inside the living room. "Starting over?" Claire nodded softly. "Sometimes life gives you a chance to build something better than what you left behind." Harold sensed there was more to her story, but respected the silence. Across the street, Evelyn watched the conversation from her front window before quietly closing the curtains. "She already found someone willing to feel sorry for her," she said dismissively. As evening settled over the neighborhood, golden sunlight painted long shadows across the quiet street while Claire sat alone on her porch, holding a warm cup of tea and watching children ride bicycles beneath towering maple trees. She smiled peacefully, grateful for the simple beauty surrounding her, completely unaware that nearly every family on the street had already decided exactly who they believed she was. What none of them realized was that fate had not brought Claire Bennett to Maple Ridge because she needed the neighborhood. It had brought her there because one day the neighborhood would desperately need her. The following morning, Maple Ridge Lane awakened beneath clear blue skies and the comforting rhythm of ordinary suburban life. Automatic sprinklers swept across neatly trimmed lawns while neighbors walked their dogs, collected newspapers, and exchanged cheerful greetings from one driveway to another. Claire Bennett had been awake since sunrise. She carefully pulled weeds from the neglected flower beds surrounding her small cottage, repaired a loose section of the white picket fence, and painted the weathered mailbox with steady, patient hands. Every movement reflected quiet determination rather than urgency, as though she believed every small improvement mattered. Across the street, Evelyn Parker watched through her kitchen window while sipping coffee from a porcelain mug. "She certainly has plenty of free time," she remarked. Thomas looked up from the morning newspaper. "Or maybe she simply enjoys taking care of her home." Evelyn smiled faintly without looking away from the window. People who are truly successful usually have somewhere more important to be. Claire finished painting before noticing an elderly woman struggling to pull a heavy recycling bin toward the curb several houses away. Without hesitation, she set down her paintbrush and walked over. "May I help you with that?" she asked warmly. The woman smiled with visible relief. "That would be wonderful. Thank you, dear." Claire wheeled the bin to the curb and wished her a pleasant day before quietly returning home. The exchange lasted less than 2 minutes, yet several neighbors observed it from a distance. One man shrugged and continued washing his car. Another nodded politely before returning inside. Evelyn simply closed her blinds. Later that afternoon, a neighborhood committee gathered near the community clubhouse to prepare for the annual Spring Garden Festival, an event that had become one of Maple Ridge Lane's proudest traditions. Volunteers arranged flower displays, decorated picnic tables, and discussed schedules for the weekend celebration. Claire noticed the activity while walking to the local grocery store and approached with an encouraging smile. "Good afternoon," she said. "If you still need volunteers, I would be happy to help." The conversation paused almost immediately. Evelyn glanced toward the clipboard in her hands before replying with practiced politeness. "Thank you, but I believe we already have enough volunteers this year." Another committee member quickly added, "Everything has already been assigned." Claire nodded graciously. "I understand. I hope the festival goes beautifully." She smiled sincerely before continuing toward the sidewalk without showing the slightest disappointment. As soon as she disappeared around the corner, one committee member quietly asked Evelyn, "We actually could use another pair of hands." Evelyn lowered her voice. "The festival reflects our neighborhood. We should be careful about first impressions." No one argued, although the silence that followed carried quiet discomfort. That evening, Harold Green stopped by Claire's porch with a small potted fern. "I heard about the volunteer committee," he said gently. Claire accepted the plant with appreciation. They were polite. "Sometimes people simply need time." Harold studied her calm expression. Most people would have taken that personally. Claire smiled as she placed the fern beside the front steps. Kindness usually grows more slowly than judgment. I have learned not to confuse the two. Harold looked thoughtfully toward the row of beautiful homes lining the peaceful street. Somewhere behind those polished windows, conversations about Claire continued without her knowledge. Some questioned her background. Others speculated about her finances. A few wondered how long she would remain. Yet while the neighborhood continued trying to decide whether she belonged, Claire quietly spent another evening making a forgotten little house feel like a home, never realizing that every act of quiet generosity was planting seeds that would soon become impossible for anyone on Maple Ridge Lane to ignore. Saturday morning brought unusual excitement to Maple Ridge Lane as residents carried folding chairs, flower baskets, and homemade decorations toward the neighborhood clubhouse for the annual planning meeting before the Spring Garden Festival. Children raced across the grassy commons while neighbors greeted one another with familiar smiles that reflected years of shared traditions. Claire Bennett arrived a few minutes early carrying a small tray of homemade blueberry muffins, hoping they might be enjoyed with the coffee already arranged on a long wooden table near the entrance. She paused politely before stepping inside, noticing that nearly every seat had already been filled. Harold Green waved warmly from the second row, inviting her to join him, but before Claire could walk across the room, Evelyn Parker rose from her chair with a pleasant smile that immediately quieted the conversation. "Before we begin," Evelyn announced, "I would like to welcome our newest neighbor. We always appreciate people who want to become part of Maple Ridge." Several residents applauded politely. Claire smiled and thanked everyone for their kindness. Evelyn continued with the same polished tone. "As many of you know, our festival reflects the pride we take in this neighborhood. Every volunteer has important responsibilities, and we normally ask newcomers to spend a year getting familiar with our traditions before participating." A few neighbors exchanged uncertain glances because no such rule had ever existed. Claire looked around the room before replying softly, "I completely understand. Traditions matter." Evelyn nodded graciously. "I am so glad you see it that way." The meeting moved on as committee assignments were announced one by one. Every family received a role: decorating, food service, children's activities, parking coordination. Even residents who had moved in only a few months earlier were given responsibilities. Claire listened quietly, realizing she was the only person whose name was never mentioned. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair but remained silent. After the meeting concluded, neighbors gathered outside beneath bright spring sunshine while chatting about flower displays and picnic plans. Claire placed her tray of muffins on the refreshment table with a handwritten note that simply read, "Please enjoy." Before leaving, she noticed a young mother struggling to keep her toddler entertained while balancing several heavy boxes of festival decorations. Claire immediately walked over and offered to carry them into the clubhouse. "Thank you," the exhausted mother said gratefully. "I have been trying to do this all morning." Claire smiled. Sometimes an extra pair of hands makes all the difference. Together they finished unloading every box within minutes. Several committee members noticed the exchange, including Thomas Parker. "She seems genuinely helpful," he quietly remarked to Evelyn. Evelyn folded her arms. "Being helpful is easy when you have nothing else to do." Thomas did not answer. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. Later that afternoon, a golden retriever wandered loose through the neighborhood after slipping out of an open backyard gate. While several residents searched from opposite ends of the street, Claire calmly noticed fresh paw prints leading toward a small wooded walking trail behind the neighborhood pond. Within 20 minutes, she gently returned the happy dog to its grateful owners, refusing every offer of reward with a warm smile. Harold observed the reunion from across the street and quietly shook his head with admiration. Everywhere Claire went, she seemed to leave people feeling lighter than before. Yet every quiet act of kindness only deepened the strange contradiction growing across Maple Ridge Lane. The neighbors continued measuring her by the appearance of her little house and old pickup truck, while the evidence of her character quietly accumulated in plain sight, waiting for the day when no one would be able to ignore it any longer. By the middle of the following week, preparations for the Spring Garden Festival had transformed Maple Ridge Lane into a picture of small-town pride. Fresh flowers lined the sidewalks, colorful banners fluttered between decorative lampposts, and volunteers moved from house to house making final arrangements for the weekend celebration. Claire Bennett admired the cheerful activity as she watered the newly planted flowers in front of her little cottage. Although she had not been invited to participate, she genuinely hoped the festival would bring happiness to everyone on the street. Late that afternoon, the neighborhood gathered beneath the covered pavilion beside the community clubhouse for one final coordination meeting. Folding chairs filled quickly as families settled into familiar groups, chatting comfortably with neighbors they had known for years. Claire arrived quietly, intending only to listen and learn more about the traditions she hoped one day to share. Harold Green smiled and motioned toward an empty seat beside him, but before Claire reached it, Evelyn Parker stepped to the front of the room with a clipboard in one hand and a practiced smile that immediately captured everyone's attention. "Before we finish today's agenda," Evelyn announced, "there is one small matter we should address." The room gradually became silent. Evelyn looked directly toward Claire with an expression that remained polite on the surface. "Our neighborhood has always taken great pride in presenting a certain image during community events. Visitors, sponsors, and local officials attend every year, and first impressions are important." Claire listened calmly without interrupting. Evelyn continued, "Since you are still getting settled and have not yet become familiar with our traditions, perhaps it would be best if you simply enjoyed the festival as a guest instead of involving yourself behind the scenes." Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One committee member quietly lowered his eyes. Another gently cleared her throat but said nothing. Claire nodded respectfully. "Thank you for letting me attend at all," she answered with a sincere smile. "I hope everything goes beautifully." Her gracious response only made the silence heavier. As the meeting ended, residents slowly filed outside into the warm evening air. Near the entrance, a little boy accidentally dropped a large box filled with handmade paper decorations. Brightly colored flowers, ribbons, and painted signs scattered across the sidewalk as the child stood frozen, his eyes filling with tears. Before anyone else reacted, Claire immediately knelt beside him. "Do not worry," she said gently. "Nothing here cannot be fixed." She carefully gathered every decoration, smoothed the bent paper pieces with patient hands, and helped the boy reorganize everything exactly as it had been packed. Within minutes, he was smiling again. His mother thanked Claire repeatedly while embracing her son with visible relief. Several nearby neighbors witnessed the entire moment without saying a word. Thomas Parker quietly watched from across the parking lot before turning toward Evelyn. "She seems to help people every chance she gets," he said thoughtfully. Evelyn crossed her arms. "Some people are very good at making themselves look generous." Thomas looked back toward Claire, who was already walking away before anyone could praise her. Something about Evelyn's explanation no longer felt convincing. Harold remained beneath the pavilion long after most residents had gone home. As he watched Claire disappear down the quiet sidewalk toward her little white cottage, he could not shake the feeling that Maple Ridge Lane was making a mistake that would soon become impossible to undo. The neighborhood believed it was protecting its traditions by keeping Claire at a distance, never realizing that the person they continued to overlook possessed exactly the kind of quiet strength every community eventually depends upon when ordinary days suddenly come to an end. The morning of the Spring Garden Festival arrived beneath a sky so clear that every home on Maple Ridge Lane seemed to glow beneath the soft golden sunlight. Colorful flower displays lined the sidewalks, children chased one another across the community green, and the cheerful sound of live acoustic music drifted through the neighborhood as families welcomed visitors from nearby towns. Booths offering homemade pies, fresh lemonade, local crafts, and seasonal flowers quickly filled with smiling guests. Claire Bennett quietly stepped outside her little white cottage carrying a basket filled with freshly baked cinnamon rolls. She had prepared them before sunrise, hoping to leave them anonymously on the refreshment table as a small gesture of appreciation for the community. As she approached the festival entrance, she noticed the volunteer station bustling with activity. Several organizers hurried between booths while Evelyn Parker confidently directed final preparations with her clipboard held firmly in one hand. Claire walked over with a warm smile. "Good morning," she said softly. "I baked a few extra cinnamon rolls. If they might be helpful for the refreshment table, I would be happy to donate them." Evelyn glanced briefly toward the basket before politely shaking her head. "Thank you, Claire, but every item has already been approved in advance. We need to maintain consistency." Claire nodded without the slightest sign of disappointment. "Of course. I completely understand." She thanked Evelyn for her time and quietly turned away. Harold Green, who had witnessed the exchange from a nearby bench, slowly stood and walked over. "Those smell wonderful," he said with a gentle smile. Claire laughed softly. "Then perhaps I should share them somewhere else." She carried the basket toward the neighborhood walking trail, where several park maintenance workers were trimming bushes before the afternoon crowds arrived. The workers gratefully accepted the warm pastries, surprised that a stranger had thought of them before thinking of herself. Back at the festival, the celebration continued as planned. Families enjoyed games, local musicians performed beneath the gazebo, and children gathered around a small petting area near the pond. Claire spent most of the afternoon quietly walking through the event as an ordinary guest. Whenever she noticed overflowing trash bins, she discreetly tied the bags and carried them to the disposal area. When an elderly visitor struggled to find a shaded place to rest, Claire offered her own folding chair before continuing her walk without waiting for thanks. Later, she noticed a young father searching anxiously for his daughter's favorite stuffed rabbit that had disappeared somewhere between the craft booths. Claire calmly retraced the child's steps, spotted the toy beneath a picnic table, and returned it within minutes. The little girl's joyful smile brightened the entire afternoon. Thomas Parker observed the moment from across the lawn and quietly shook his head. "She never asks for recognition," he murmured. Harold smiled knowingly. "Some people serve because it is simply who they are." As evening approached, the festival concluded successfully. Residents congratulated one another on another memorable community celebration while colorful decorations were carefully packed away for the following year. Evelyn accepted compliments from visitors who praised the organization and welcoming atmosphere of Maple Ridge Lane. Yet as she glanced across the quiet park, she noticed Claire helping fold empty tables beside several volunteers who had never realized she had not officially been part of the committee. Claire smiled as though she had belonged there all along, asking for nothing in return. The neighborhood still believed they understood exactly who their quiet new neighbor was, but beyond the distant tree line, dark clouds were beginning to gather over the mountains, carrying with them a test that would soon reveal which kind of character truly mattered when comfort and certainty disappeared. The weather forecast changed overnight, but very few people on Maple Ridge Lane paid much attention to it. Early Sunday morning, gray clouds slowly replaced the bright blue skies that had filled the previous day's festival, and a steady wind began pushing through the towering maple trees that lined the quiet neighborhood. By noon, emergency weather alerts appeared on mobile phones across the county, warning residents that an unusually powerful storm system was expected to arrive before sunset. Most families assumed it would simply bring heavy rain. Claire Bennett quietly stood on the front porch of her little cottage, studying the dark horizon with thoughtful eyes. She listened carefully to the increasing wind, watched the movement of the clouds, and noticed details most people overlooked. Without hesitation, she began securing outdoor furniture, tying down loose garden equipment, and moving flower pots away from exposed areas. Harold Green walked slowly across the street, curiosity evident on his face. "You seem to think this storm will be worse than they are saying," he remarked. Claire offered a calm smile while fastening another rope around a storage container. "The forecast has become more serious over the last hour. It is better to prepare now than wish we had prepared later." Harold nodded thoughtfully before returning home to secure his own property. Across the street, Evelyn Parker watched Claire through the front window before quietly laughing to herself. "She is acting as though a hurricane is coming," she said. Thomas looked toward the darkening sky. "The weather alerts do seem stronger than usual." Evelyn shrugged confidently. "Every year someone predicts disaster. Every year it is just another storm." As afternoon faded, the wind strengthened dramatically. Tree branches swayed with growing force, patio umbrellas turned inside out, and scattered leaves raced across the pavement. Families who had spent the morning relaxing outdoors gradually hurried inside, closing windows and bringing pets into their homes. Claire continued moving calmly from one task to another. She knocked on several nearby doors, politely reminding elderly residents to charge their phones, gather flashlights, and keep bottled water nearby. Some thanked her warmly. Others smiled politely while assuming she was simply being overly cautious. Evelyn answered her door with a restrained expression. "Thank you for your concern," she said. "I think we will be perfectly fine." Claire nodded respectfully. "I sincerely hope so. If you need anything later, please do not hesitate to come across the street." Evelyn closed the door without replying. By early evening, rain began falling in heavy sheets that blurred the neighborhood into shades of gray. The wind howled through the trees, shaking windows and scattering small branches across the roads. The power suddenly failed, leaving Maple Ridge Lane illuminated only by occasional flashes of distant lightning beyond the hills. Inside their homes, families searched for candles and flashlights while emergency alerts continued arriving on battery-powered phones. Claire calmly switched on portable lanterns she had already prepared, checked her emergency supplies, and stepped onto her covered porch despite the driving rain. From there she quietly surveyed the neighborhood, her expression focused rather than frightened. Harold noticed her silhouette across the street and realized she was not simply watching the storm. She was assessing it. One by one, porch lights disappeared into complete darkness. The peaceful certainty that had defined Maple Ridge Lane only hours earlier had vanished with the electricity. And while most residents waited anxiously for someone else to tell them what to do, Claire Bennett had already begun thinking several steps ahead, carrying a quiet confidence that came not from hope alone, but from experience that no one in the neighborhood had yet begun to imagine. The storm intensified with astonishing speed, transforming Maple Ridge Lane from a peaceful suburban street into a neighborhood struggling against uncertainty. Heavy rain drummed across rooftops, while powerful gusts bent tree branches until they scraped against darkened windows. Emergency sirens echoed faintly somewhere beyond the hills, followed by another alert warning residents to remain indoors and prepare for extended power outages. Inside their homes, anxious families searched for batteries, candles, blankets, and portable chargers, quickly realizing how unprepared many of them actually were. Claire Bennett quietly stepped back inside her cottage and unfolded a weather-resistant neighborhood map from a small waterproof folder resting inside a kitchen drawer. Beside it lay neatly organized emergency supplies, rechargeable lanterns, first aid materials, portable radios, and handwritten checklists prepared long before she had ever moved to Maple Ridge. She studied the map for only a few moments before calmly putting on a waterproof jacket and carrying 2 lanterns into the rain. Harold Green noticed her crossing the street through the storm and opened his front door. "Claire, where are you going?" he called. She smiled reassuringly. "I need to check on the older residents first. Please stay inside unless someone needs immediate help." Harold nodded without another question because, for reasons he could not fully explain, her calm voice inspired confidence rather than fear. House by house, Claire knocked gently on doors, making certain every elderly neighbor had heat, medication, drinking water, and a reliable flashlight. She reassured worried families, helped one couple safely move important medical supplies into a cooler with ice packs, and quietly organized several neighbors into small teams so no household would be left completely alone if the outage continued overnight. She never raised her voice. She never appeared rushed. Her steady presence gradually replaced panic with purpose. Across the street, Evelyn Parker watched everything unfold from behind her living room window. "How does she seem to know exactly what to do?" she whispered. Thomas looked toward Claire, guiding several neighbors with remarkable confidence despite the driving rain. "I do not think she is guessing," he answered quietly. "I think she has done this before." Before either of them could say another word, headlights suddenly appeared through the rain at the entrance to Maple Ridge Lane. Several emergency response vehicles slowly entered the neighborhood before stopping near the community clubhouse. Uniformed personnel stepped out, scanning the area with flashlights as one senior officer spoke into a handheld radio. A moment later, his eyes settled on Claire. Without hesitation, he walked directly toward her. The surrounding neighbors fell silent, watching through windows and covered porches as the officer removed his rain hood and offered Claire a respectful handshake. "Director Bennett," he said with unmistakable relief, "we were informed you had recently relocated here. Command asked us to check whether you were available to assist with neighborhood coordination until additional crews arrive." The rain continued falling, yet the entire street seemed to pause. Evelyn slowly opened her front door, unable to believe what she had just heard. Thomas stared toward Claire in complete disbelief. Harold smiled quietly, as though a mystery he had sensed from the very beginning had finally found its answer. Claire greeted the officer with calm professionalism. "Thank you for coming. Several elderly residents will need priority assistance if conditions worsen, and I have already organized temporary neighborhood support groups." The officer nodded immediately without questioning a single instruction. Around them, neighbors exchanged astonished glances. The young woman they had dismissed because of her modest clothes, old pickup truck, and quiet lifestyle was speaking to emergency officials with the confidence of someone they clearly respected. For the first time since Claire had arrived on Maple Ridge Lane, nobody cared what kind of truck she drove or how small her house was. They were all asking themselves the very same question. Who had they truly been living beside all this time? The senior emergency officer listened carefully as Claire Bennett outlined the neighborhood's immediate needs with remarkable precision. She identified which homes contained elderly residents living alone, which families depended on refrigerated medication, where portable generators could be safely placed, and which streets would likely become inaccessible first if the storm continued moving east. Every recommendation was calm, organized, and delivered without hesitation. The officer quickly relayed her assessment over his radio before turning back with an expression of unmistakable respect. "Exactly as expected," he said. "Your evaluation matches the latest reports from County Emergency Management. Neighbors standing beneath covered porches exchanged stunned glances. Evelyn Parker slowly stepped into the rain, barely noticing the cold wind as questions raced through her mind. One emergency volunteer approached Claire carrying several laminated maps. "Director Bennett," she said, "the Regional Coordination Center has asked whether you can advise our local response until additional resources arrive." Claire accepted the maps with quiet professionalism. "Of course," she answered. "Let us begin by making sure every family knows they are not facing this alone." Without seeking attention, she calmly divided volunteers into neighborhood teams, assigning simple responsibilities that anyone could perform. One group checked on senior citizens every 30 minutes. Another distributed lanterns and bottled water. A third helped families safely relocate outdoor furniture before stronger winds arrived. The atmosphere changed almost immediately. Fear slowly gave way to cooperation because every person finally understood what they could do to help someone else. Thomas Parker watched the transformation with growing admiration. "She organized all of this within minutes," he whispered. Harold Green smiled gently. "Real leadership becomes visible when everyone else is looking for direction." As emergency crews continued setting up temporary equipment near the community clubhouse, another county official arrived and greeted Claire with obvious familiarity. "I cannot believe you retired from regional disaster operations without telling half the state," he said with a warm laugh. Claire smiled modestly. "I wanted a quieter life." The official nodded knowingly before turning towards several curious residents. For nearly 15 years, Director Claire Bennett coordinated emergency response programs across multiple counties. Thousands of families reached safety because of the systems she designed. She never cared about recognition. She only cared that people made it home. The neighborhood fell completely silent. Evelyn felt every conversation she had ever started about Claire replay inside her memory. She remembered the old pickup truck, the simple dress, the small cottage, and every careless assumption she had confidently shared with others. None of those things had ever reflected who Claire truly was. They had reflected only what Evelyn had chosen to see. Slowly, she walked toward Claire, her confident posture replaced by quiet humility. Rain continued falling around them as she struggled to find the words she should have spoken weeks earlier. "Claire," she said softly, "I owe you more than an apology. I judged you before I ever gave myself the chance to know you. I mistook simplicity for weakness and kindness for someone trying to impress us. I was wrong." Claire looked at her with the same calm expression she had carried since the day she arrived on Maple Ridge Lane. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, no desire to remind Evelyn of past insults. Only compassion remained. "We all see the world through our own experiences," Claire replied gently. "The important part is deciding whether we are willing to see more clearly tomorrow than we did yesterday." Evelyn lowered her eyes, deeply moved by the grace she did not feel she deserved. Around them, neighbors quietly stepped closer, no longer gathering to whisper judgments, but to stand together as one community. In the middle of the storm, the greatest change was not taking place in the weather. It was taking place inside the hearts of the people who had finally learned that true character is revealed long before anyone learns a person's title. By sunrise the following morning, the storm had finally moved beyond the mountains, leaving Maple Ridge Lane wrapped in a peaceful silence unlike anything the neighborhood had experienced before. The air smelled of fresh rain, scattered branches rested along the sidewalks, and a few fences leaned slightly where the strongest winds had passed. Although cleanup would take several days, every family had remained safe, thanks in no small part to the calm organization that had guided the neighborhood through its most difficult night in years. Claire Bennett quietly walked along the street carrying a clipboard, checking on each household one final time before the county emergency crews completed their work. She thanked every volunteer personally, praised neighbors who had helped one another, and made certain no elderly resident had been forgotten. She never spoke about her own role. She simply smiled whenever someone thanked her and redirected the credit toward the community. Several weeks later, Maple Ridge Lane gathered once again beneath warm spring sunshine, this time not for a festival but for a neighborhood appreciation picnic organized entirely by the residents themselves. The atmosphere felt different from every gathering before it. Conversations were warmer, laughter came more easily, and people who had once walked past one another now stopped to share stories and offer help. At the center of the park stood a newly planted maple tree surrounded by a simple wooden bench. A small bronze plaque rested beside it, engraved with a quiet message chosen by every family on the street: kindness is the strongest foundation any neighborhood can build. Harold Green smiled as he watched children play beneath the branches while neighbors arranged picnic baskets across the lawn. Evelyn Parker slowly approached Claire, holding a basket of homemade bread. "I used your cinnamon roll recipe," she admitted with a shy smile. Claire laughed softly. "Then I hope everyone enjoys it." Evelyn looked around at the families talking together. "I spent years believing a beautiful neighborhood was measured by perfect houses, expensive cars, and impressive appearances. You taught me that a beautiful neighborhood is measured by the people who show up when someone needs them most." Claire gently shook her head. "You chose to learn that yourself." Thomas joined them carrying folding chairs while several neighbors waved Claire over to join a game with the children. Nobody viewed her as the outsider anymore. She had become the person everyone naturally included, not because of her accomplishments, but because she had quietly earned their trust long before they knew anything about her past. Later that afternoon, the county emergency officer stopped briefly to deliver the final restoration report. Before leaving, he smiled at the gathering and said, "Communities rarely remember every storm they survive. They always remember the people who helped them through it." His words lingered long after his vehicle disappeared down the road. As the sun slowly settled behind the maple trees, neighbors folded tables together, shared leftovers, and promised to check on one another more often in the months ahead. The little white cottage that had once inspired whispered judgments had become the place where fresh bread, extra garden tools, borrowed books, and friendly conversations were always waiting. Claire never asked to become the heart of Maple Ridge Lane. She simply chose kindness every single day until kindness quietly transformed everyone around her. And in the end, the greatest blessing the neighborhood had ever received did not arrive in a luxury car or behind an impressive title. It arrived wearing a simple light blue dress, carrying an open heart, and reminding every person on Maple Ridge Lane that the richest lives are built not by what we own, but by the compassion we choose to give before we know who someone truly is.